Okay, so good morning and welcome to the Self-Care, Self-Defense, and De-escalation workshop. My name is Sarah Holstead, and I'm the Hospital Library Services Program Manager at Southeastern New York Library Resources Council. Thank you all for joining us today. We're running this workshop as a webinar, not a Zoom meeting, and so you're entering the meeting muted and with camera off, but you can interact via the chat and the Q&A located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please use the chat for comments and direct questions to the presenters in the Q&A. I'll be monitoring both, but again, if you put your questions into the Q&A, it will be easier to find. If these features present an accessibility barrier to you asking a question, please send a private chat to the panelists. At this time, I invite you all to take a moment and say hello in the chat. And also right now, I'll drop the URL of today's workshop into the chat. It's got the resources and the handouts from this presentation, and the slides will be posted there. And the other thing that it has is the link to the live stream link for captioning. So I'll be posting these links a couple of times as we go on. So next slide, please. So self-care, self-defense, and de-escalation is the second in a series of workshops that will take place over the next few months about planning for emergencies in your library and community before they happen. Part of being resilient in the face of emergencies is knowing how to take care of your mental and emotional health, which is why we invited Dr. Nitsa and Dr. Vermeulen to speak with you so early in the series. They also presented about psychological first aid and self-care way back in May, and the recording of those webinars is linked on the workshop website. I'd like to call your attention to 3 upcoming events in this series. The first is the Disaster Planning Working Group, which is going to meet this week on Thursday. It's an informal discussion group, and this week we're going to go through the risk assessment worksheet for libraries from the first workshop. You didn't have to attend the first workshop to come to the meeting, and so email me if you're interested in joining us. The next workshop in the series is on Monday, November 9th at 1. About planning for extended electrical outages. Registration is open now, and you can get the link on the workshop website. And finally, through this grant, we're offering a free online course developed by the National Library of Medicine and the Medical Library Association to earn a disaster information specialization certification. If you have questions about any of this, please get in touch with me. This workshop series is funded with a grant from the National Library of Medicine, and I would like to acknowledge their support. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this material do not necessarily reflect the views of the National Library of Medicine or the National Institutes of Health. I'd also like to acknowledge the Southeastern staff who are here today helping behind the scenes, Carolyn Bennett-Glauda and Tessa Killian. Thanks, you guys. So next slide, please. We started planning for these workshops way back in February in response to events we saw happening at libraries in the Southeastern region. This was not a response to the pandemic, but as we've seen over the past few months, natural disasters haven't been put on hold for the pandemic. Even without a major weather event, closing and reopening libraries in the middle of a pandemic brings whole other layers of stress. The way we experience emergencies or disasters or daily pandemic life is deeply personal, and the trauma can be life-altering. I just want to acknowledge the experiences that you all may be bringing to this workshop and ask that as speakers or commenters and listeners, we respect the narratives that may be shared today. I wanted to thank and acknowledge everyone who responded to the survey last week with examples of situations in your libraries where you needed to de-escalate. There was such a large response, and because I'm a librarian, I put the types of conflict into categories to help our speakers with the context. This is not to minimize the anguish and aggressive acts that came through in your stories. Some of what you describe seems to be made worse by how libraries operate. There's so much aggression around small library fines, and what would our lives be like if we didn't have those fines? But some stories were more location or even policy specific. I just wanted to say that we heard you and you're not alone. Our presenters cannot today address all of the scenarios you described, but they will unpack some of the emotional responses we or our patrons have in stressful situations and discuss strategies for coping. Again, these slides and resources on this page will be posted after the presentation. In a moment, I'm going to turn the workshop over to our presenters. Before we begin, though, I want to go over a few details. This presentation is being recorded. What you type into the chat will not be recorded with the video. We trust that you'll be courteous and respectful to other attendees and follow the Southeastern Code of Conduct. Anyone who uses the chat in an abusive or threatening way will be removed from this webinar. The presentation is being live captioned using otter.ai. You can see a link to it at the top of your screen. If you click on it, a new screen will open in your browser, which you can place to the side of your Zoom window to see the caption in real time. If you have trouble getting the captions to work, private message Carolyn or me in the chat. Again, during the presentation, please use chat for comments and direct your questions to the presenters using the Q&A. The presentation slides will be available soon after the presentation at the workshop website. We will also have CE certificates available upon request, and I'll drop a link to the CE request form and the course evaluation form into the chat at the end of the webinar. So again, thank you for being here today, and I'm so happy to welcome Dr. Amy Nitze and Dr. Carla Vermeulen. We're really looking forward to what they have to say. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Amy Nitze now. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. I just want to first start by thanking all of you, Sarah and Carolyn and Tessa, for inviting us to do this. Carla and I have said before that you know, we've gotten asked to do a lot of different kinds of trainings for a lot of different kinds of groups, but this one, it has sort of a special place for both of us in terms of working with you all as librarians. So thank you so much. So I am Amy Nitze. I'm the director of the Institute for Disaster Mental Health at SUNY New Paltz, and we created, and I will be giving this presentation with my colleague, Dr. Carla Vermeulen, who's the deputy director. Do you want to say hi now, Carla? Or?
Sure. Yes, delighted to be joining this group again. As Amy said, we're both huge fangirls of all the librarians and the libraries out there. It's been a huge part of my life. And I think in working with Sarah and Carolyn and Tessa, we've started to get a sense of how hard the work that you do is under normal circumstances. And these are anything but normal circumstances. So we hope that this will give you some skills to at least kind of mitigate some of the particular stressors you are going through.
Awesome, thank you. So our agenda for today is we want to start by focusing on, as Sarah said a minute ago, really focusing on you and the importance of taking care of yourself and maintaining your own personal resilience throughout whatever situations are thrown at you. And then we're going to talk about some skills for preventing de-escalation. Always better to prevent and prevent it from getting to a point that feels out of control or that requires de-escalation. And then we are going to talk about strategies for de-escalation when it does start to feel out of control. And then we're going to loop back at the end to taking care of yourself after something happens that is distressing or upsetting. So really we're sort of packaging all of this skills for working with other people in terms of also really maintaining your own wellness regardless of what gets thrown at you. And we do have a few more resources that we'll share with you that you can use hopefully after this presentation is over. So just starting with the piece about staying resilient, and I want to frame this as being able to respond instead of react when a situation occurs that feels upsetting or distressing or conflictual to you. So just a quick background. Some of you may have seen this before if you were in one of our other workshops, but just a quick grounding in sort of what's happening to us physiologically and emotionally when something stressful happens. So our brain, the emotional and the rational part of our brain kind of work together to help us manage stress and manage difficult situations as they come up. And so a metaphor that I like a lot for how this works is the work of Bessel van der Kolk. And he talks about a metaphor of the smoke alarm and the watchtower. So the smoke alarm is the emotional part of your brain, and it's the part of our brains that is designed to monitor our environment for potential threats. That's its full-time job. And then the rational part of the brain, once the emotional part of the brain identifies a threat or the smoke alarm goes off to alert us to a danger, the rational part of our brain, the job of it is to sort of act as a watchtower. So it sort of scans the environment, looks at what the threat actually is, and then decides on a plan of action and activates that plan. So this is the part of our brain that decides whether, the smoke that we're seeing or we're smelling is a result of an actual fire or the result of, getting the toast stuck in the toaster and so having some smoke. And so the smoke alarm notices the smoke, it goes off in our brains, right? Metaphorically. The rational part of our brain then scans the environment. Where's the smoke coming from? What do I need to do? Do I need to call 911 and get the kids out of the house? Or do I just need to throw out the toast and, open the windows for a little while and let the house air out? Once we've activated that plan, then the smoke alarm can go back off in our brain, and that part of our brain returns to its baseline monitoring function for other threats that may be happening in the environment. And so in daily life, managing stress relies on a balance between those two parts of the brain. So that mechanism and the balance between the smoke alarm and the watchtower works pretty well. We're designed to be able to manage a fair amount of stress using that mechanism. But in times of really extreme stress, and also in times of traumatic stress, it can be as if the smoke alarm gets stuck in the on position. And if you've been in your house when that smoke alarm gets stuck in the on position, it's really overwhelming, right? You can't do anything else. You can't concentrate on anything else. You can't sit down and, and focus on paying bills or whatever it is you're doing when that sound is going off. And so when that happens in our brains, what's happening is that this part of our brain gets stuck in the on position, and then the rational part of our brain, which we also use for concentration and memory and sequencing a set of actions and being able to execute those actions, focusing our attention, all of those things. That part of the brain goes offline. It's as if it gets overwhelmed and it just kind of shuts off. And so we're functioning only, sort of all of our body and our brain's resources are focused on getting that alarm to shut back off at the expense of all the other things that we typically do in a day, right? At the expense of being able to focus our attention or concentrate or, our memory function, our sort of planning and executing our day, all those executive functions. So that brain being stuck in the on position, the smoke alarm being stuck in the on position really is an inhibiting factor in terms of being able to rationally plan, make a decision in a rational way, and then figure out how to solve that problem or how to execute that plan. Which, when you're dealing with sort of a situation that feels like a crisis or is highly conflictual or feels dangerous, you kind of want to have both parts, you do want to have both parts of your brain working together pretty well, and not be acting just out of that smoke alarm threat detection place. So this is where the idea of resilience comes in. So there's a lot of, resilience is almost a buzzword these days, but the definition that we're going to use for purposes of today is being able to stay in or quickly return to a place of mental balance and emotional balance after it's been disrupted by a potential threat. So, the smoke alarm will go off, maybe it gets stuck for a little while, but how quickly can you get it back into that place of balance? And so being in that place of balance is what we refer to as responding versus being out of balance and reacting only out of that emotional part of the brain. That is what we're going to refer to as reacting. Okay, this image here I like a lot because I think of sort of resilience as your umbrella against the storm, whatever the weather is throwing at you. If you have your umbrella, you can try to stay dry. And this guy looks like he's even going about his day on his phone. I don't know exactly what he's doing, but that's the purpose of the image here. So again, responding versus reacting. So we're going to refer to, for the rest of today, we're going to refer to responding as being in a green zone. And that's when our brains are in balance, the emotional and the rational part. And so when we're in that place, our body's in its resting state. It's in its place of perceived safety and grounding. And from that place, we're able to make a set of decisions and execute that plan of action in a way that harnesses all of our resources, psychologically, emotionally, cognitively. We're going to refer to reacting as being in a red zone. And that's when our brain is triggered into that place of imbalance with the rational part of our brain going offline. So our brain is in that, what's referred to as fight or flight or fight, flight, freeze mode. When we're in that place, our body and our brains are acting out of a place of perceived deficit and disturbance. And so all of the systems in our body are disturbed, physically, emotionally, cognitively, and we're really just working in a place of trying to get the smoke alarm to go off. And so we're not able to make good decisions. So I'm going to go back for just a second. So what our goal here, and the reason we're leading with this in terms of this presentation today, is that the goal is for you to be able to stay in a green zone responding place, regardless of what's being thrown at you. So it's your umbrella against whatever the sort of weather of being in the library for the day is. And while it's outside of the realm of today's presentation, just a quick reminder that there are lots of ways to build that resilience, to practice and rehearse so that it's almost like developing muscle memory in your brain to allow you to more quickly get back to that place. And so there are cognitive-based strategies that work with your thoughts and the self-talk or the chatter that we all have that sort of runs as a tape recorder in our brains. And so you can, in terms of building resilience, you can start from the place of working with those thoughts. You can also start from the place of emotion regulation and working to be able to more quickly regulate your emotions directly. Those are often strategies like mindfulness, meditation, yoga. And you can also start from a behavioral place. So really what I'm talking about here in this context is physical exercise, which also has a really good calming effect and allows you to stay in a more regulated place. So the point of this particular graphic is that you can, whichever one of those places feels like a place where you could start and work to maintain your own wellness, start there, because they all influence each other. If you start from a thought-based place, eventually you're going to have better behavioral regulation as well. Excuse me. Okay, so with that as our goal for ourselves, to be staying in the greens, to develop our resilience, to develop our ability to get back to a green zone place after we've been triggered into a red zone place. All right, now we're going to talk about preventing escalation, communicating to support others when they're in distress. And so we're making the assumption here that we're doing that with our best effort at doing that from our own internal green zone place. So one of the things I think it's really important to consider is this is a quote, actually, I believe from my dissertation chair. I don't know if this was a long time ago, and I don't know if he was quoting someone else when he said it, but he used to say to me, Amy, behavior change by itself is unacceptable to people in distress. And I think that's really important to consider in this place, because in the topic that we're talking about today, because a lot of this is what you're asking people to do is do something differently. And that's where the conflict comes in, right? They don't want to pay their fine. They don't want to put on the mask. They don't want to move from the child's room to the adult room. They don't want to stop whatever behavior you're asking them to stop doing or to start doing. And so when people are upset, when people are in distress, when they're in when your patrons are in that red zone place, asking them to do something differently can be an unacceptable thing until they have de-escalated, right? So now the goal here is for you to be in a green zone and for the other person to also be in a green zone. Once you're both in a green zone place, now you have something to work with. You have a grounding, the other person has a grounding. But if you go in leading with expecting behavior change and the person is in distress, meaning they're probably in a red zone place, you may not get them to do what you want them to do, and you may actually unintentionally reinforce their red zone status. So when people are struggling, when they're in distress, things that aren't helpful that they experience a lot are, and I'm not saying necessarily by you, but this is kind of in general, this is, I think, really important to think about. They don't benefit from having their feelings or concerns minimized or dismissed. They do not benefit from being told to stop feeling what they're feeling. If that worked, Carla and I would be out of jobs, right? If just telling someone to not be angry or to calm down or to stop crying or to stop worrying, if that worked, we wouldn't even really need to be having this conversation today. And they don't benefit from advice or being told what to do or not do. And so I want you to keep that in mind as we talk about what people do need, or what they do often benefit from is the ability to be able to express their concern, to have that concern heard and understood, and then reflected back to them from another human being in the form of being validated or experiencing empathy. And so the definition of empathy that I like a lot, and this is from the work of Brene Brown, who's pretty popular both in terms of books and on YouTube and podcasts. You can get a lot of access to Brene Brown's material, but she says that empathy is understanding or feeling what another person is feeling, what another person is experiencing, from within their frame of reference. And there's something about the power of that, of being heard and understood by another human being, that helps people start to re-regulate themselves when they're dysregulated. So when people are in a red zone place, yourself or someone else, the first thing that people are looking for before you get to behavior change, before you ask them to do something different, is to reflect back and validate, express empathy toward, those are different ways of saying the same thing, the person that's struggling. And I like this so much that this Brene Brown sort of idea about this, that I'm gonna show you this quick, I think it's about 2-minute video on this, on Brene Brown's definition. Oops, sorry. Here we go. Okay, so can someone just shout out at me if you can't hear this?
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Okay, so in terms of the actual sort of mechanics of doing this, because it's not often how we talk to each other in sort of colloquial conversation, You know, an empathy statement is really just acting as a mirror. It's reflecting back what you heard the person say. And so it can be as simple, and you can think about reflecting back the content of what someone shared, or their thoughts or their emotions about that thing. And so we just have these little sentence stumps here because I think it's easier to think about it that way if you don't know how to start. But, you know, you could say something like, wow, it sounds like you're really struggling to be able to, you know, come up with the money for this fine, or it sounds like you're really, you know, uncomfortable being asked to wear a mask in this situation, whatever the thing is. Any of those, and obviously those are just examples. Anything can be, any sort of stem like that can be a good way to start. The other piece that I want to reinforce about this is that it's sometimes I think people freeze when they try to express empathy, particularly in terms of reflecting back someone's emotions, because they're afraid they're going to get it wrong. And I would argue that that's actually okay, and it's not a bad thing, because if you say, wow, it sounds like you're really, you know, angry about being asked to, you know, wear a mask in all these different situations, the person might say, actually, I'm not angry. I'm just, you know, I'm just worn out. I'm just discouraged. I'm just whatever. That if that kind of exchange happens, first of all, now you've been able to clarify. So now you better understand their situation, and probably they also understand their own situation better. Because when someone, if I say, wow, it sounds like you're really upset, and you say, no, I'm not upset, I'm just sad, that allows me as the person experiencing the emotion to really think about what is the emotion I am feeling. And that can be a really powerful way to sort of start that re-regulation process as well. Another reason this is important, I think Carla might get into this in a minute later, but is the idea of mirror neurons. So there are brain cells in our brains, I guess that's where brain cells are, that allow us or cause us to mirror the emotions of the person in front of us. And so that happens at a level way beyond anything that we have conscious control over. So if you can really work on staying in a green zone place, and then reflecting back to the person, the emotions in front of them, that's where the emotion regulation and the de-escalation of the person's own emotions starts to happen. If you, however, get agitated and upset and you start to mirror it's going to go one of two ways. And so you being able to be the one that stays in a green zone, and through then reflecting empathy, expressing empathy, and connecting to the person in front of you, they're going to start to de-escalate, instead of it being the other way around and you getting hooked into their red zone place and you starting to get into that red zone place yourself. When you're expressing empathy, these are just some things to be avoided. I'm not going to go through all these, but I think the video did a pretty good job of it. But, you know, telling someone to stop feeling what they're feeling is well-intended, and we do it a lot. Don't worry, don't feel bad, don't cry. But again, it just simply does not work. And then those things where you say, at least you still have, at least whatever. If you're, you know, our sort of phrase is that if your sentence is going to start with the phrase at least, just don't say it, because anything that happens after that is going to feel dismissive or invalidating to the person in front of you. And in this case, you do not want people to feel invalidated, because that is going to escalate their level of dysregulation instead of de-escalating it. So, you know, I've been talking about all kinds of emotions, but anger is, I think, the one that you're, at least through the responses that you gave to Sarah's survey, anger in different forms is a lot of what you're dealing with here. And so, first of all, people are going to express their anger at a target around them that may or may not be the actual cause. That's just how we are wired as humans. So there may be a rational reason for directing your anger towards someone, and likely in some of the situations that you guys are dealing with, it's not rational, but there needs to be a person for whom the person is discharging their anger. So first of all, I know this is so much easier said than done, but do your best not to take it personally, because it's not personal. It's the person being hijacked emotionally, needing an outlet to express that emotion. And what they need, just like with any other emotion, is to feel heard and understood, and to be able to just get some of that emotion expressed. Okay. And so validating that, empathizing with that anger, staying in your own green zone place, and not getting hooked into responding back from a place of anger is step one. Again, easier said than done, but the more that you can practice doing that, and this goes back to the self-care stuff at the beginning and that we're going to close out with at the end, the more you are practicing good self-care on a daily basis, the easier it is going to be for you to stay regulated and to be able to validate someone's anger instead of being triggered by it. I think I just said this a minute ago, but so your goal is to not get hooked, not to absorb their anger, but to be the one who stays calm. And I think maybe a helpful thing to think about here is that anger is a surface level emotion. Most of the time, what is underneath anger is fear or sadness, which I think are the two characters I have here. It's from the movie Inside Out. Anger was the other little guy, and these are fear and sadness. And so often people lead with anger, but what is underneath that anger is fear, sadness, shame, guilt, some other sort of softer, easier to connect with emotions. And so a trick, and this is a trick that counselors use as well, is to remind yourself when someone's feeling angry that what's underneath that anger is hurt or sadness or fear or whatever, and try to connect with the hurt or the sadness underneath it instead of responding to the anger. And if you can do that, you will stay in a softer, greener place, and you will help the other person get there more quickly as well. Often as soon as the anger is really validated, then the person can let go of the anger, and then you're going to get to the other emotions underneath there, which are so much easier to deal with and to be in the presence of. So, you know, when someone is angry, another way, or a related way, I guess, to think about it is that anger is a sign of a lack of safety on the part of the other person, or on the part of you if you're starting to feel angry. So when you notice the anger happening, what do you need to do to get the other person to reestablish a sense of safety so that the other person can feel safe enough to have a regulated conversation with you? So when you notice that happening, when the anger starts to escalate, which is then correspondingly when the level of safety between the two of you starts to decrease. If you can step out of the content of the conversation, whatever the content is about in that moment doesn't matter, whether it's about the fine or the room or the noise or the or the mask, step out of the content of the conversation and rebuild safety often by, you know, your best tool here is empathy, reflecting what the other person is feeling, validating their experience, then re-engage around the content, right? So there's a content versus the process. And when things are going haywire, you have to stop you don't have to. The best practice is to stop with the content, focus on the process, recreate a sense of safety between the two of you as much as you can, then re-engage, okay? That's the formula, if you will, for preventing the escalation. But as we know, as you've all very well experienced, it doesn't always work that way. And so I'm now going to turn it over to Carla to talk about what happens or what you can do when it does escalate.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to assume everyone can hear me at this point. So hang on one second, let me just get my video showing correctly. Okay. All right, so yes, as Amy just said so eloquently, you know, you can do the best you possibly can to try and prevent something from escalating, but sometimes it is going to. And so here is now the next section. We're going to talk about, you know, some classic de-escalation approaches. And we realize, you know, some of this may be pretty basic for some of you. But, you know, hopefully it's a useful refresher for those who have been through this kind of content before. And it seemed like from the survey, like people were sort of at different levels of experience. And so maybe this will be useful for those of you who are a little earlier on as well. But we will bring it back again to what happens if this is not sufficient. Okay, Amy, next slide, please. Thank you. So basically what we're looking at this point is what happens when it goes beyond just someone who is angry and ventilating, really to someone who's reaching a level of crisis. And so this is obviously what you want to avoid. You're not always going to be able to avoid it, but this is really when we're getting into a situation where the person is not just unpleasant to be dealing with, but potentially actively dangerous. And that could be physically dangerous, but that could just be emotionally dangerous, traumatizing for other people to be exposed to. And again, deeply unpleasant for sure. So when someone is moving towards this state of crisis, hopefully before they get fully blown into it, what you're trying to do with these de-escalation tactics is bring it back down. Like maybe it's kind of reached a boiling point, but hopefully it's not too late, and hopefully you can bring it back down a bit. There are a number of different reasons that someone might get into this very extreme state. Certainly it could be someone who is grappling with a mental illness, certainly some forms of substance abuse, or in some cases it could be withdrawal from drugs of abuse. I'm sure I know libraries are often dealing with people who are addicted to opioids and using, or maybe they are in withdrawal and they're very agitated and lashing out because of that. Could be some kind of cognitive impairment like dementia, someone having a diabetic crisis that's causing them to act irrationally, but it could just be that they are just so stressed out. And I suspect you're seeing that kind of cause a lot more than in the past, which is not to say the other more typical sources are not present, but I'm guessing there are a lot more people who just because they're so stressed by everything around the pandemic, they're a lot closer already to that boiling point to begin with. And so it's much harder to, or, they're much more likely to kind of escalate, and they're harder to de-escalate. And I would say anxiety is probably present in all of these, very much like what Amy was just saying about safety being an issue. Well, that's very closely related to anxiety. I would say, very few people who are feeling safe and stable and in control of their lives are likely to head into a behavioral crisis. So I think that's going to be, it might be demonstrated as anger, but it is, that's one of these underlying factors to deal with. Okay, next slide, please. So just some of the behavioral markers. I mean, this is probably stuff you all see on a fairly regular basis, but certainly the person is not just angry, but they are going to be acting it out in certain ways. There are going to be visible indicators. It's pretty uncommon for someone just to be sort of silently fuming and then suddenly explode. It's not impossible, but generally a person's going to get kind of worked up, and you'll be able to spot some of these signs. And so maybe that's an indication that, as challenging as it might be, you want to take the initiative and step up and try and connect with this person, when they're starting to display some of these, before it becomes, to a point where it's kind of uncontrollable and you really do need to call in outside sources, although certainly you should do that if that is necessary. But all of these, honestly, just like reading this list makes me anxious to be thinking about encountering some of these behaviors, especially if you're in a library that has very few staff members for backup, or you're in an isolated area or something like that. It's scary to, most of us don't know martial arts or aren't prepared to deal with kind of physical threats in our lives. And so just recognizing, address this before it reaches that extreme point. Next slide. So just the underlying message of this is going back to the whole red zone analogy Amy was talking about. A person who is in this state is fully in the red zone. They are not thinking rationally. They are not using judgment. They are not assessing threats at a rational level. They're probably having all sorts of distorted thoughts. They're viewing everyone as the enemy or out to get them. And so, as Amy said, it's really hard to get, or it's hard to get someone out of this, but it's not impossible. The thing to keep in mind is you have to do whatever you can to not match them in the red zone, to not escalate yourself. Okay, next slide. So this, I think, is one of the first point is one of the underlying messages that we're trying to communicate in all the trainings we're doing, whatever the topic is. We all have to recognize and figure out there are things we can control in life and there are things we can't control in life. And unfortunately, there's a lot we can't control right now, which is probably why so many people are so anxious at the moment. But you can always control your own behavior, even though that might be challenging and it takes some practice and some discipline and some attention and some mindfulness. But you just have to recognize whatever you're doing, hopefully you can change the other person's behavior, you can alter it, but you can't control it. So part of what we're going to be talking about is kind of how do you cope with something when when everything that you're doing is not sufficient. But hopefully it will be. You certainly want to wait, back up, thank you. You want to maintain your physical distance. You want to stay, I've seen different estimates. You don't want to be so far away from them that they feel like you're like you're seeing them as threatening, but you certainly don't want to get into their comfort zone of personal space. And that's difficult to know because that's going to vary for different people. Everything I'm talking about, there are going to be cultural factors that are involved in it, and you're not necessarily going to know what the culture of the person or their individual preferences are. But I think you want to approach them to the point where you are able to have a quiet conversation, because part of this, as we'll see, is keeping your voice down, your tone down. But if you move towards someone and they start backing up, that's a sign you've reached as close as you can. Similarly, if they're moving towards you, don't hesitate to back up. And if you can put a physical barrier between you, like library desk or something like that, a table, whatever's going to make you feel more secure. You don't want to startle them. And if you are moving towards them, then explain. I mean, basically with all of this, ask permission. Is it okay if I come over to you? Could we sit down and talk about this? Involve them as a partner as much as possible in the interaction. Generally, you want to make eye contact. However, some people are very uncomfortable with that. So kind of take a cue from them. But usually eye contact is a sign of respect. It reinforces that connection. It shows you're seeing them as an equal. But again, some people, if you're perceiving that that's making them uncomfortable, don't do that so much. And Amy touched on this, but tone of voice is probably the most important thing that you can be focusing on, apart from breathing, which I'll come to next. But as she said, it's not so much the content of the conversation, especially if what they are saying is, in your view, irrational or incorrect or unfair. Just trying not to engage with the subject in particular until you have kind of formed that alliance, created that sense of understanding. Then hopefully you have a basis for going back and addressing any misperceptions, clearing up any confusion, all of that kind of stuff. But to begin with, it's really just calming them down. Okay, next slide. Back to anger. As Amy said already, it is so hard to recognize, or not to recognize, to accept. I mean, I think we all recognize sometimes we're going to be the target of people's venting and frustration, and it's not fair, it's not fun, but it is unfortunately going to be a part of the job for many of us. But just keep reminding yourself, it's not about you, it's something going on. It is it's the underlying sadness, fear, anxiety, uncertainty, whatever. I've heard this referred to as like the anger is the tip of the iceberg floating above the water, but the big part underneath is all of those other emotions that maybe you could find it easier to empathize with if you keep reminding yourself. And I think that, having this boundary, it's almost like you want to learn to have a kind of invisible force field between what you present to the public and what are your internal feelings. So it's almost like putting on your librarian costume in a way that is not insincere or ungenuine, but recognizing, I mean, I do this as a professor. I am a different persona when I'm in my professor role than when I'm in my human role. And things that are said to me as a professor by unhappy students or colleagues or whatever, I try to sort of compartmentalize and recognize, okay, that's part of my professional role. That does not reflect on me as a person. Not always successful at that, but it's something to, maybe try and practice a little bit. And then most importantly, just having an actual plan when you are the brunt of someone's anger unfairly. What are you going to do with that? So that you don't then turn around, you've absorbed it from them. Hopefully you've calmed them down, but now you're agitated because of that. How are you going to prevent yourself from then turning around and lashing out at your colleague or your patron or your partner or whatever? So we'll come back to that in the kind of self-care portion of this, but that is certainly not just recognizing this is difficult, but having a strategy for dealing with this very unpleasant part of the job potentially. All right, next slide. And this is really what it all comes down to. How are you going to keep yourself in the green zone? So very wordy first point, but this is the mirror neurons thing. We literally reflect facial expressions. We reflect breathing patterns that we're seeing. We reflect body language. So how often have you found yourself, talking to someone who's angry, and you can't really see my arms, but my arms are folded and, scowling face. And maybe you realize like you are mirroring that, which of course then makes them double down on that and feel that even more. So just everyone really would benefit from learning to catch yourself when that is starting to happen. So pay attention to your breathing. Often that's sort of my first indicator when I'm picking up on someone else's distress, because people who are stressed, they're usually breathing kind of fast and shallow and rapid, not the kind of slow, deep breaths that help us calm down. So I try to be very attentive to that. And if I realize I'm starting to breathe very quickly and shallowly, trying to force myself to take a deep breath, to relax my body language, to not have that kind of clenched posture, but the kind of open body language where you're facing someone directly. You're making that eye contact if that is appropriate. Basically just kind of, again, trying to train yourself to bring that down, because hopefully at that point, if they're not really fully in crisis, hopefully that will be sufficient to start to bring them down as well. And then I think this idea of self-talk, this is something we've been really looking at a lot. We did a whole training, one of the ones that Sarah referred to in the earlier series we did May 30 years ago, it feels like, was on self-care and stress inoculation in particular, as well as the psychological first aid one. Really encourage you to go back and watch those if you haven't seen them. But I think stress inoculation is a great way of kind of recognizing what is that sort of, what is making me anxious? What is the message I'm telling myself about what is going on? And how can I figure out how to deal with it? So I'll come back to that a bit in a minute, but, even just if you are spotting a patron who is looking like there's going to be trouble or a situation you're going to need to deal with, is the voice in your head saying, oh no, not this again, I can't handle this, I don't have the energy for this? Or is the voice, can you retrain the voice in your head to be saying, okay, I have to deal with this, I have the skills to deal with this, I have people I can turn to for backup, I can get through this. It's not going to be the best part of my day for sure, but I can do this and hopefully I can accomplish a good outcome. So it's the fake it till you make it approach, reframe that script in your head. And it's amazing how sometimes that's enough to at least give you the energy to walk into a situation with the goal of staying calm and with the recognition that that's something you can accomplish if you try. Again, not always going to be sufficient. I recognize some of the situations you guys deal with are really above and beyond, but hopefully that's going to help. All right, next slide. So this is coming back to active listening, which is the core to preventing situations from escalating. And it is even more essential when someone really is at this level of crisis and you're trying to bring them back down again. So Amy's covered a lot of this, but just think about this at like super intensity level now. And that is hard. It's hard enough to deal with someone who's reasonably calm, but is saying things that you think are unfair or inaccurate. Now think about how you're going to try and do that with someone who's really in this state of higher agitation or upset or crisis. but just trying to have that empathy, trying to figure out, that perspective taking point. What is this person going through? What is happening that is making them behave this way? And what can I do to try and figure out, is there stuff I can help them with without giving them that advice or telling them what to do, for sure. But how can I kind of get information from them? How can I have that conversation to try and understand what is driving this behavior for them? Hopefully start to bring them down between having a calm, as rational as possible conversation, all of your breathing, all of your body language. So get them back to the point where they can think a little more rationally, and then coming back to this idea of, okay, how do we solve this situation? There was a perceived problem here, whether that was based in reality or not, or was very distorted. How do we address that in a way that is reality based, so that we can hopefully solve the problem or at least mitigate it, and maybe connect them with resources or whatever the next step is going to be. Okay, next slide. This is literally just what Amy said before, but just a reminder on all of this, use those empathy statements, try and really grasp it from their perspective. Apologize. I'd say there's a lot higher chance when you're in one of these escalated situations that someone's going to say, no, that is not what I'm trying to say. They are likely to be misunderstood because, again, they are not expressing themselves in a clear way. They are not basing their reactions on accurate understanding or interpretation of the situation that they're in. So if they're misinterpreting what is going on, of course, it's likely that you are going to misinterpret their attempts to express what they are experiencing or upset about. So this may take a while, but just kind of keep trying and keep kind of bringing them down a notch at a time and a notch at a time. Okay, next slide. Don'ts, Amy covered kind of the basic don'ts, but reinforcing this, this is absolutely a situation where if this person is very clearly almost always not feeling heard, not feeling understood. So if you interrupt them, if you challenge what they are saying in a very overt way, if it's clear that you are judging what they are saying or not believing what they are saying, that is going to further escalate their anxiety or their upset emotions. As we've said before, don't tell them what to do, don't minimize, and this, as I said, just don't get fixed on the thing that they are saying, but try and figure out what is underneath that. And all of the don'ts, once again, to remember, the don't calm down, just, Amy said, telling someone to calm down, never effective, usually counterproductive. Saying that's not true, even if it's a fact that that's not true, that is just going to blow any kind of rapport that you might be attempting to establish with them. And then all the shoulds, you need to, I need you to, the person in this situation is likely feeling anxious, they're likely feeling out of control, they're likely feeling judged in some way. And I think people in this situation often know that they are acting in an inappropriate or irrational way. And so anything that's kind of calling them out on that, again, might make them double down on that, make them operate out of a place of shame or embarrassment for the way they're acting in a public place. And it's probably, in your situation, the library is a public place that is a lifeline for a lot of people who are getting into these situations. I'm willing to bet if we surveyed people who are the really challenging patrons, often it's because they see the library as a safe place for them. They see the librarians as helpers, people that they trust. And so when they're in a situation where they're in conflict with library policies or with the librarians, I would be willing to bet that that is another source of stress for them. So, that can be, if that is the case, maybe that can be used to your advantage to kind of, again, create that rapport, remind them that they can trust, they are in a safe place in the library. Now, I will fully say some people are jerks. Some of the people who are shouting at you are the same people who shout at the grocery store clerks and the waiters in the restaurants and all of that. So I'm not saying everyone has that kind of empathy or, that sympathetic basis for what they are going through, but I'm willing to bet a lot of them do. So, okay, next slide. All right, this is my extremely wordy slide, but basically, if you are not, even if the escalation is starting to work, you absolutely have the right to set limits and to enforce those limits. You cannot, for the safety of yourself, the other patrons, your colleagues, you cannot obviously let people just continue to do things that are unsafe or inappropriate for others around them. So it is perfectly fair and necessary to have limits, but ideally you're going to do that and frame that as a choice so that the person understands the consequences of what's going to happen if they don't follow the limit. So, it's not helpful to just say, you have to wear the mask. They're going to say, I'm not going to wear the mask. If you just keep saying you have to wear the mask, it's the policy, that is not going to put them in a position of understanding what will happen if they don't wear the mask. So instead, making it very explicit, and this is a very obvious example, I'm sure, but if you agree to wear the mask, you can stay in here, you can keep using the computers. If you choose not to follow the policy, that is a choice you are making. And the consequences of that is that you will be, I don't know what policies would be, but you'll have to leave now, or you won't be allowed back in for a week, or whatever the actual consequences would be. So you're not just telling them what to do, you're helping them understand, okay, I have a choice in this. I have agency in how this situation is going to end. And then you want to let them think about those choices for a bit, not expect them to be able to make that decision right away, because remember, they're in the red zone. They are not thinking clearly. They are having a hard time weighing consequences and judging the results of their behaviors and their decisions. So let that kind of settle in silence, and hopefully they will make the choice you want. But either way, essentially they will be making that choice for themselves. Okay, next slide. Now, obviously they might not make either choice, and it might be necessary for sure to bring in security in some way, bring in backup from other colleagues, and if that needs to be done, that needs to be done, and you shouldn't hesitate to do it. But we really encourage you to think about having kind of a stepped approach to bringing in backup. Clearly, if someone is a danger to themselves or others and calling 911 is the only option, call 911. But I think, especially from all of the reports of police actions against people who are in psychological distress, that there have been many examples of in the news in recent months and years, and forever really. Sometimes, law enforcement is not really going to be the best source of support, because that is definitely going to make the person continue to escalate, to feel unsafe, to feel threatened. And that is much more likely to end in some kind of, not necessarily violence, but a pretty extreme result or extreme actions. So be aware, have a plan within your library of what else is available. Are there security guards on the premises? Depending on the size of your library, my understanding is that may or may not be the case. So, clearly that is a first choice before 911. If you're a college library, is there a university police department? Community, but also, does your area have a mobile crisis unit that has the ability to deal with physical threats, but also comes from a mental health perspective, and they have extreme training in de-escalation, and they are more likely to get someone connected with mental health support if that is what they need, rather than having them end up in the local jail. So just, be aware, it's going to vary tremendously depending on where you're located and the resources in your community, but have a list of that, have a plan for that, and make sure that information is available. Because if you are in a real crisis where you feel like you need to call in support and you think, oh wait, I think there's a mobile crisis unit, but I don't have the time to look that up, so I'm just going to call 911 as a default, then that's going to end up being the action. So make sure all that information is posted and everyone knows where it is, and etc. Okay, next slide. So all of that, I'm sure there are people out there saying, yeah, we've heard this. Sometimes the stuff works and sometimes it doesn't. And that is just the fact. There are going to be situations where you do have to call in law enforcement or other, have the person removed from the premises. So this goes back to the what can you control and what can't you control. This is another area where you can control your behaviors, your training, the training people on your staff receive, the policies that you have, the signage, the way you communicate policies, all of that stuff. You can control that. You cannot control every patron's behavior. You cannot control every colleague's behavior. So how are you going to handle a situation if something doesn't have the outcome that you want? Or even if it was, it ultimately did, but it was so unpleasant that you're kind of struggling with it. So this is when we get back into some of the principles of stress inoculation and figuring out what you can do when something has happened that you really can't control. So learning to accept that and learning to not judge yourself, learning to forgive yourself if you recognize things that you could have done differently. I'll come back to that in a moment. But basically here is where you might do better by recognizing, if you have these emotions coming out of an experience that are difficult, that are challenging, how are you going to handle those emotions for yourself? And so here's where some of the more mindfulness stuff can be very helpful. So these practices like figuring out how you're going to relax, how you're going to handle the emotions that you're feeling, regulate your emotions so you're not getting overwhelmed and hijacked by them, bringing yourself back down when you are starting to escalate. As I said, your own anger, if you've taken that on from someone else. And then just what do you need to do to just get your mind off of it in some ways. So watch the stress inoculation video or training if you haven't, but now we'll get back into more detail on what to do next after you've been through something. Next slide. Okay, so this could be after a major incident, or this could be after just something small, but that's really bugging you for some reason. So next slide. So if you have been through something, chances are, even if it's kind of a routine, unpleasant interaction with a patron or a colleague or whoever, it is likely that has caused some amount of distress for you. Hopefully not full blown into the red zone, but you're feeling it afterwards. I'm conflict averse in general. And when I get into a conflict with whoever it is, I feel that for a while. It really takes me a while to kind of process what I have been through. So what we're encouraging you to do in this section is not just chalk it up as, okay, it's part of the job, I have to suck it up and move on to the next crisis or the next situation, but really have a plan for how you're going to cope with what you have been through, what you are feeling about it. We're talking about this mostly for yourself, but this also, if you have a colleague who's been through something, especially if you're a supervisor and you're seeing maybe more junior staff members who you're trying to support through something, this can certainly apply to them as well. So those of you who have taken the psychological first aid training, you might have, that included talking about these evidence-based principles of early intervention. So these are kind of the guiding principles of disaster mental health and crisis intervention. And this is basically 20 of the top experts in the world kind of came together and looked at both the empirical research that was available on crisis and disaster response, and then also their own experiences in the field. And they basically identified these principles of early intervention as the most essential ones for supporting others shortly after they have been through a traumatic or just very challenging experience. And so I think these apply just as well to ourselves. So I hope this framework will kind of make sense in terms of thinking about the needs that you might want to address in yourself and others. So sense of safety and calm, efficacy, connectedness, and hope. So I'll go through each of these, how these might apply to you. So sense of safety and calm, we'll lump these together into one. But basically, this is just, reminding yourself, if your fight or flight response has been activated in the situation. And that can happen certainly even if it's not that you're feeling a physical threat, but if you're feeling a social threat or a threat to your authority or standing or to your skills, those things, even if you're physically safe, it still can totally activate that response for sure. So what that means is you have this flood of stress hormones in your bloodstream, in particular cortisol and adrenaline. And those stay in your body for a while, depending on how strong that activation has been. So, you might know that the encounter is over. You might know that you are perfectly safe. The person is gone. You resolved it to whatever degree, but you don't feel safe for a while. So, acknowledging that and not saying, why can't I calm down? Why am I still feeling agitated? It's because your body is built to be that way. That is the watchtower part. I'm sorry, that's the smoke alarm part. It's better safe than sorry. Your body's going to mobilize everything you have to respond to a perceived threat, but we don't just come down from that automatically afterwards. So you need to figure out how to get back to that sense of safety, that sense of calm. So certainly breath work is very important here. Intentionally breathe slowly. There's a lot of good exercises like, inhale slowly for a count of 4, hold it, exhale slowly for a count of 4. You can find a million apps that'll do breath training, things like that. Just reminders, keep saying it over and over again. So the little voice in your head is not telling you we're in danger, but we're safe. It was bad. It was unpleasant, but we're okay now. I think one thing that's interesting is the fight or flight response, because it was meant to prepare us to respond to a physical threat. Sometimes, if the action that we have to take is not actually fighting or fleeing, but is something more intellectual, more verbal, we're left with that kind of physical need to do something. So sometimes some people find it helpful just to literally shake it out, jump up and down, go run up and down the stairs a couple of times. It really can help just to, give your body some sense like, yeah, okay, we've done what we needed to. So now we can move on from this. And then, just this kind of leads into the next point on connectedness, but just whatever is going to make you feel calm. Distract yourself, call a loved one, have a conversation with a colleague about how difficult that was, without getting into details so much at this point, but just something to help you feel settled again. Okay, next. Very closely tied to this is restoring that sense of connectedness. We know that is the most important thing for people going through difficult times. So, sometimes talking to a mental health professional is great, but it's really generally our friends and family, our colleagues, the people that we really trust, who are going to be the most helpful in terms of helping us kind of start to feel okay again. So don't just suck it up and try and deal with it on your own. Don't get into that kind of myth of, I can't acknowledge that this was hard for me. People will judge me if I say I need help with this. And for supervisors, create a climate, if you can, among your staff that it's encouraged. It's not seen. You're not going to face judgment if you say you need help processing something that you've been through. But really encouraging people to support each other in this way. And for some people, you might want to think about what you tell about this experience to colleagues versus to friends and family. Again, it's that kind of divide between your professional persona and your personal persona. Hopefully those are pretty well meshed, but sometimes we don't want to reveal certain things to colleagues. Similarly, sometimes we don't want to reveal certain things to friends and family if it's going to worry them or trouble them about what we have been through. So think about kind of who you're going to turn to for which kind of support, and do that. And then I hope this isn't too Pollyanna-ish, but if you can kind of frame this, it's not, silver lining, but there's a phrase that Amy has used in previous trainings that our brains are, what is the phrase? They are Teflon for good experiences and Velcro for bad experiences. We tend to focus on the negative. So you might have one really negative interaction with a patron out of 100 or 500 in that day. So, trying to have that perspective, trying to remember most people you're dealing with are good and appreciate your work, hopefully not enough for sure, but to some degree, so that you don't just fixate on that one really negative side, but remember the positive connections, that all the people that you do actually help effectively. Next. And the sense of efficacy. When we go through something difficult or traumatic, sometimes we feel helpless or we judge ourselves for our performance. And I mean, you absolutely, in hindsight, can 100% think of something you could have done differently, better, wish you had done differently. That's not the focus of this point so much, but this is to say, okay, how can you make this a lesson to recognize what you did do effectively, remind yourself that you have skills, and also then feed that forward. So the next time, unfortunately, you end up in a similar or parallel situation, how will you feel more effective? How will you have more confidence in your ability to deal with that moving forward? And very important that you might not want to do this first step right away, because this can be very contrary to the whole point about feeling safe and calm. Because if you revisit an experience very shortly after it happened, especially while you're still in the throes of or close to that fight or flight response, it's likely to escalate that again. And that's the opposite of what you want at the very beginning. So maybe let a little time pass till you do feel safe and stable again, and then revisit it. And, as we say, it's not to judge yourself, but to recognize, okay, what can I control? What did I control? What was I maybe trying to control that was outside of my control? And that's why something didn't work potentially. How can I redo that or do that differently in the future? And then also looking at that, not just what did you do personally, but at that institutional level. Do we need to alter our response plan? Do we need to have a clearer policy for when to bring in backup, more access to other resources, whatever the situation is, but using it to hopefully improve things moving forward rather than just looking backwards and blaming yourself or judging yourself. Okay, next slide. Okay, almost done. And then the last of these 5 principles is instilling hope. And that, I think, is always one of the trickiest ones because, when we're talking in our usual roles as disaster mental health responders, the hope is not that the disaster didn't happen. The hope is not that your home wasn't destroyed. It's helping people find a form of hope that is realistic and hopefully will actually turn out to be true. So this is, looking for positives, but once again, without downplaying the negative sides, because it was not a fun experience. But, is there something you can take out of this? I hope in the end, this helped this person in some way. Even if that's helping them learn they can't be abusive like this. That's maybe a positive lesson that you might have taught them. I hope I can apply this. I hope I can do better. I hope that whatever the interaction with the colleagues were. So, this is going to be very individually and situationally dependent, but just trying to find something positive so that you can keep going, so that you don't have that Velcro effect again, where all you can think about is the negative experience. All right, next, I think that's it for me. Yes, so I'm going to hand it back over to Amy, and then looks like we will have time for some Q&As. Certainly happy to address any of this. Back to you.
Thank you. So really that was the conclusion of the meat of the presentation, but we just did want to highlight some resources that we have provided to you and also some of the resources that we drew from in putting this together in case anyone wants to do a deeper dive on any of this. So in the link in the chat that Sarah has provided, there are 4 things there. One of the ones that you'll see, which is the de-escalation and self-care planning worksheet. This is a worksheet that walks you through the steps of stress inoculation. So that Carla was referring to earlier, and that also is the topic of part of the topic of a previous webinar that we did for you all. So, but it's sort of like a planning ahead. How can you prepare ahead for which of these kinds of situations are likely to be the most distressing to you, and then working through the process of planning what you're going to do. And it's so important that preparation process allows you to have some safety and security, that when you are triggered, that you still have something that you can refer back to, so that you don't have to make a response up on the fly. And also then knowing that that is there, reading through that, you're not relying on the rational part of your brain to have to do that in that minute. It's already been done for you. So doing that ahead of time when you're calm. Carla and I talked about, maybe this is a good exercise to do individually, but maybe it's also a good exercise to do as a staff, to kind of have a plan for how are we going to handle these things. And we're talking about mostly about your own reaction to those things. And then at the end of that worksheet, we've also added some steps for thinking through the principles that Carla just talked about of safety and calm and connectedness and efficacy and hope. So, you know, we just offer that to you as a way to sort of personalize what we've just been talking to you about. We also offered, skipping down a second, the self-care assessment worksheet and the self-care planner. So none of this is rocket science. None of it's going to be something that you haven't, I would be surprised if there's anything in there that you're not already aware of. But again, there's something about the process of looking at it, having to think through, and having to write it down. So the assessment worksheet is in different areas of your life: physically, emotionally, spiritually, whatever. What are you doing and what are you not doing? And maybe what are some goals that you have for yourself? And although, you know, with my eyes closed, I could make a list of what good self-care practices are. Am I doing them on a daily basis? Of course not. And so just that accountability. So the worksheet and the planner go hand in hand. And then finally, what we've offered, this is not something that Carla and I created, but the professional quality of life scale, a professional quality of life instrument. It's a well-established, it's got good reliability and validity. And it's also an open access free instrument that measures your level of compassion satisfaction in your work and your level of compassion fatigue. And by compassion fatigue, we're talking about all the things that burn you out or that cause some level of secondary traumatic stress, which is the kind of things we've been working about, absorbing, being exposed to and absorbing the stress of other people. And so it's self-scoring. So you can complete it. You can have your staff complete it. Again, there's no copyright issues here. And then you can take it over time. So you can take so one of our recommendations is take we call it the ProQual, the professional quality of life instrument, see where you're at in terms of your level of burnout and compassion fatigue and those things. And then work on the self-care, work on those other tools, implement those other tools for a little while, maybe a month, something like that. And then take that professional quality of life instrument again and see how it's working. And then be able to adjust accordingly. Okay, so you have access to all of those materials. And then here are just some resources that we have drawn from in putting this together. So the SAMHSA best practices for dealing with a behavioral health crisis, like the kind of ones we've talked about. So many good books on resilience, de-escalation, conflict management. Two of the ones that I drew on today that you'll see in this presentation are the work of Rick Hansen. The book is called Resilient, and he summarizes so well the best of a whole bunch of brain science on all the things that we need to stay calm and have a sense of strength during difficult times, and including communicating in difficult situations. And then another one that I like a lot is the book called Crucial Conversations. It's not really so much intended to be a de-escalation book, but he talks about the different, like, what is your goal in any communication? And one of those is solving problems. One of those is making connections. And how do you sort of alter your speech or your approach to a situation, depending on what your goal is in that conversation. And then we have the maybe here because there are a lot of trainings that you could take that are for a fee. And so we're not really in the position to recommend any of them or not recommend any of them, but we do know that they are there and they are available. And that's it for us. That is how you can get in touch with us. But Sarah and Tessa and Carolyn also all know how to get a hold of us. So we're happy to help you all out as we can.
Well, thank you so much, Amy. This has been, I mean, I've gotten so much from this. And thank you to Carla. And I just want to call people's attention to, we're dropping in the chat, but you can also see on the slide just quickly, we'd love to have your feedback. The next workshop is on November 9th. And if you would like a CE certificate, we'll also drop the link to that in the chat. But let me move to people's questions because we have some really good ones. So I'll read them out to you and then you guys can have a thumb war about who's gonna respond to them. So first one is, when you're the person on the front line dealing with these stressful behavioral crises, most often at your library, how can you best communicate the emotional toll that this takes to library leadership who often don't experience or witness it themselves? Consistently de-escalating situation leaves me exhausted and dreading work some days, and I don't know how to communicate to my supervisors without them feeling like I'm complaining.
I'll take a stab, and you can build on my probably insufficient answer. My first response to that is document. I mean, can you keep a running list of all of these incidents so that they see this is not just one cranky customer a day, but, you know, have some kind of monitor tracking. And so you have kind of evidence of the extent of the issue and how stressful it is for people. I don't know. I think if I was a supervisor, I would like to think I would be an empathetic supervisor in general, but I think kind of having that kind of evidence of what is going on and how frequently people are dealing with this, and especially if that's coming from not just this particular staff member, but from everyone, so that they can see, you know, this is not just one person overreacting to what they're being asked to do, but everyone is kind of feeling this. But I understand that there could be sensitivity in kind of being the squeaky wheel about this, but it's essential. I mean, if you're dreading going to work, you're going to get burned out and you're going to not be able to continue it, or you're going to get so upset that you're not going to be able to engage empathetically and openly with even the patrons who are not causing trouble. So, you know, it's to management's benefit to recognize this and provide the tools and the training and the support that's needed.
The only thing I would add is, in terms of the data, just building on Carla's suggestion here, is use that professional quality of life instrument. You know, we didn't make that up. That's a normed instrument. And so people can, you can demonstrate you know, pretty empirically the level of fatigue and burnout that people are under.
Okay, great. Next question is, how do you provide a choice during de-escalation without it feeling or sounding like a threat?
You want me to go first?
Sure.
Okay. So, you know, one of the things that we talk about is giving the more someone is in distress. So the more heightened the level of anger or sort of out of controlness, the less they can do open-ended thinking. And so giving people clear, concrete choices can actually provide a little bit of safety and a little bit of grounding to that person. And so I think it's all then just about how you frame it. So, you know, I would often, you can play around with how you do it and see how the person responds, but I would often lead with we, right? So I think we have a couple of choices here. One of the things that we could do is choice A. Another thing that we could do is choice B, or perhaps we could try choice C. Does one of those feel better to you than the other? Something like that. If people seem to be pushing back against the multiple choice sort of option, and you want to try to say, or is there another option that you see that might work? But that's if something about the multiple choice options is causing somebody to feel threatened by only having those choices, then I think you could play around with opening it back up. But just be thinking about how many choices are you providing? Make sure all the choices that you offer are ones you can actually live with. Don't give them a choice that's the wrong answer, right? Because then you're setting you and them up to fail. So the number of choices, whether you're opening it up or closing it down in terms of the number there. And are you leading with the word we? Are you leading with the word I? The word you is often a threatening way to lead, so I would stay away from the word you is the other thing I would add there. Carla?
And also avoid or else.
Yeah, it doesn't end well.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's never, never a positive. Okay, so final question, Amy, how do you apply these lessons to customer service over the phone? Sometimes these are the situations that are easiest to escalate when you cannot look someone in the eye or read their body language.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, it's so hard. I was having a conversation with Carla and someone else yesterday, and there was no conflict at all, but it was just me not being able to read Carla's reaction to know if she and I were on the same page about what we were saying to the person or not. It really is a challenge. So I would go slow. I would take a deep breath before any response to make sure that the person is done, and to regulate yourself and calm yourself before you respond. But the same principles still apply. People need to feel heard. It's a little more awkward to do a reflection, I think, over the phone before, or even like this, even virtually, I found it harder to stop and do a reflection statement. It feels a little more socially awkward than it does in person. But so even more important to really focus on that. So before just jumping to interrupting someone or answering their question, or unintentionally, interrupting someone, slow down, take a deep breath, purposefully insert the reflection of feeling or the empathy statement, the validation, wait for the response, then offer the choices. And again,
Okay.
Yeah, I would just add to that, to Nancy, I 100% validate that people can be horrible on the phone when they don't have to look you in the face and see how you are reacting. Worst job I ever had was as a phone reservationist for a very hot new restaurant, and people screamed at me all the time because they could, they weren't seeing how that was impacting 20-year-old me at that point. So people just, they behave differently when they don't have, and so that does make it even harder for sure to calm them down and stay calm yourself. And even more important, to have that kind of plan for how are you going to deal with it when someone is hostile or aggressive to you in that format.
That's great. Well, so I thought of one question as you guys were kind of talking through examples. And if this is putting you too much on the spot, just say so. Boundaries are good. But I wondered if you could role play for us an interaction about asking someone to put on their mask. This question just comes up repeatedly. And so I think it would really help to see some of these skills in action. And I can be the belligerent customer if you want.
Oh my gosh.
So if this is too much, just say so, and we'll do an offline YouTube or something.
I would be happy to record one that we could then post in your links if you want to do it that way. It feels really
too
with a minute,
too spontaneous.
Yeah. I don't want to unless you go, Carla.
No, I like your plan.
Okay.
Let's do that though, seriously, Sarah. Let's record a couple different ones that people could play with.
I think it would be really nice. Even for me, I would really appreciate seeing someone model the behavior, and just really have, this is also new. I need somebody else's words at this point, and I would like for them to be the right words. And so I think that would be really helpful. Okay. Well, so we'll follow up about this.
Yeah, please.
So I think, and Nancy says thank you. And so, right, let me just add to everybody who's saying thank you. We really appreciate you guys taking the time to consider the issues that are going on in libraries and that are facing front desk staff, no matter the type of library. So again, just thank you for your time. To all the panelists or to the attendees, thank you for staying. Take a moment to fill out the survey, request the CE certificate. We'll be following up in an email with you. And so again, just thank you for attending. Thank you to Amy and to Carla, and everybody have a good and safe day. And hopefully we'll see you at the next webinar.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Carolyn. Thanks,
Thank you all. It's good to have you.
Yeah.
Thanks all librarians out there. Stay strong.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording now.
Okay, thank you.